When British newspapers received the match result by telex on that June night in 1950, most editors assumed there had been a printing error. Someone had inverted the scoreline. Surely the result was England 1, United States 0. Not the other way around. Never the other way around. And yet, it was exactly the other way around. And what happened inside that muddy pitch in Belo Horizonte, on an afternoon England would rather erase from memory, is one of the most astonishing stories football has ever produced. A story with a hero nobody knew, a team nobody took seriously, and a goal that the world took decades to accept as real. To understand the magnitude of what happened on that 29th of June 1950, you need to understand who England were in football at that time. Not the England of today, struggling to get past the quarterfinals and carrying the eternal weight of 1966. We are talking about the England of 1950, a side that had just entered its very first World Cup in history. That is right. Their first World Cup. The nation that invented football, that exported the sport to the entire world, that considered every other nation a permanently inferior student, had refused for decades to participate in the tournament it had itself inspired. When England finally agreed to compete in 1950, in Brazil, the feeling in the British press was that the World Cup would at last be crowned with its rightful champion. The English arrived in Brazil with the quiet arrogance of those who have nothing left to prove because they believe they have already proved everything. England, for their part, had arrived in Belo Horizonte with players who were absolute stars of European football. Tom Finney, Stan Mortensen, Wilf Mannion. Names that filled stadiums across Europe and that, to the Americans, belonged to a universe as distant as the moon. The British press had already reserved space for title coverage. Bookmakers in London were offering odds of 500 to 1 against England being eliminated at that stage. 500 to 1. It was less likely, according to London bettors, than a snowstorm in the Caribbean in July. The pitch in Belo Horizonte was not helping anyone. The Independencia Stadium, where the match would be played, was a small ground with uneven grass and conditions that bore no resemblance to the perfect surfaces the English were used to in Europe. The Brazilian heat, the altitude, the humidity, everything was foreign to those players who had crossed the Atlantic convinced that physical effort would be the least of their problems. But football, as it tends to do with those who arrive too confident, was about to deliver one of its most memorable lessons. The opening minutes of the game confirmed what everyone expected. England dominated the ball, created moves, circulated with evident quality and technical superiority. The Americans ran, defended, organized themselves as best they could, but it was clear to any neutral observer that the question was not whether England would win, but by how many goals. And then came the 37th minute. Walter Barr, the American midfielder, received the ball in midfield and shot from distance. It was a low-pretension attempt, more of a speculative effort than a planned move to score. The shot traveled toward the English goal, where goalkeeper Bert Williams was already preparing to make the routine save that it clearly was. And then the man who would change the history of American football stepped into the story. A man who, despite everything, was never properly celebrated by his own country. Joe Gaetjens. Born in Haiti, naturalized as American, a player for the Brookhaven Football Club in New York, a man who washed dishes in a Manhattan restaurant to pay his bills while dreaming of playing football. Joe Gaetjens threw his head at the trajectory of Barr's shot and deflected the ball in a completely unexpected direction. Goalkeeper Williams, who had already read the original trajectory of the shot, was entirely wrong-footed by the deflection. The ball went in. USA 1, England 0. The stadium erupted. The Americans looked at each other without fully understanding what had just happened. The English continued on the pitch as though it were merely a temporary setback, as though the natural order of things would reassert itself in the coming minutes and the match would end with the scoreline the entire world expected. But the following minutes passed. And the ones after those. And England created chances, had opportunities, hit the woodwork, and forced saves from American goalkeeper Frank Borghi, who that afternoon played as though possessed by some football deity that had decided, for reasons known only to itself, to protect that American goal at any cost. Frank Borghi. Another name that deserves to be said out loud. Before becoming a World Cup goalkeeper, Borghi had played baseball in the American minor leagues and worked as a hearse driver. Not exactly the profile of an Olympic hero. But that afternoon in Belo Horizonte, Borghi was impenetrable. Every English shot found his hands. Every cross found his fist. Every attempt to equalize found a human obstacle that should not have been there, but that, for some reason that transcends statistics and sporting logic, was. The final whistle blew. USA 1, England 0. The silence that followed was almost physical. The American players looked at each other, still not fully grasping what they had done. The English stood motionless on the pitch with that specific expression of someone who has just been told something that contradicts everything they believed to be true. And across the Atlantic, in the newsrooms of British newspapers, the editors who received the result by telex did the only reasonable thing one can do when reality completely contradicts expectations. They assumed it was an error. The Daily Express, one of England's most important newspapers at the time, published the result as 10-1 to England, assuming the scoreline had been transmitted incorrectly. Other newspapers simply chose not to publish the result at all until they could verify it with more than one source. The idea that the United States had beaten England at football was so absurd, so fundamentally incompatible with the worldview that English football had built for itself over decades, that denial was the natural and immediate response. But the facts were the facts. And the facts said that Joe Gaetjens, the Haitian-American dishwasher, had scored the goal that humiliated the country that invented football. That Frank Borghi, the hearse driver, had kept that goal intact for 53 minutes of English pressure. That the gravedigger, the physical education teacher, and the last-minute recruit had all played their part in one of the greatest upsets in World Cup history. The story of Joe Gaetjens after that goal is, in itself, one of the most tragic in football. He returned to Haiti in the years that followed, the country where he had been born. And in 1964, during the brutal dictatorship of François Duvalier, the Papa Doc, Gaetjens was arrested by the regime's political police. He was never seen again. His family never learned with any certainty what had happened to him. The man who scored the most improbable goal in World Cup history vanished into the darkness of a Caribbean dictatorship without the football world raising a single voice in his defense. It is one of the most disturbing silences in the history of sport. England, eliminated in the first phase of that 1950 World Cup, returned home without a title, without answers, and with a wound to their pride that took decades to begin to heal. The defeat to the United States was so traumatic that the English, for a long time, simply preferred not to speak of it. There was no possible narrative that made sense. There was no technical, tactical, or climatic explanation that justified that result. There was only football, with its cruel and wonderful ability to overturn every hierarchy within the space of 90 minutes. And there is something profoundly poetic in the idea that the country that invented football, that refused for decades to participate in World Cups because it believed the world had nothing to teach it, received its first definitive lesson from a team of workers, immigrants, and amateurs who barely had money to pay their own way to the stadium. Football does not respect reputations. It does not respect records. It does not respect expectations. It respects only the 90 minutes and what happens inside them. And inside those 90 minutes in Belo Horizonte, in June of 1950, something occurred that history books would take decades to accept, but that the scoreline recorded without hesitation. USA 1, England 0. Forever. If this story gave you chills, tell me in the comments what you thought of it. This is exactly the kind of episode that shows why football is different from any other sport. It is the only place where the world can be turned upside down in 90 minutes, without warning, without explanation, without justice. Tell me too which city and country you are watching from, because this channel receives people from every corner of the world and I am genuinely curious. Hit the like button if you made it this far, because it helps the channel grow more than you might think. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe now, because there is so much more great content on the way. Oh, and one last thing. While researching this story, I came across a very special product connected to the world of classic football and the nostalgia this era brings. I will not give it away here, but you can find the link in the first pinned comment below the video. Worth checking out, no strings attached. And hold on to this before you go, what you just watched is only the beginning. There are stories in football that are even more improbable, even more human, even harder to believe than this one. And they are coming soon, right here, on this channel. You will not want to miss them.